Okay, our next panelist is Joseph Carroll from the Department of English at University of Missouri, St. Louis.
I'm going to break this talk into 4 pieces. First, going to talk about the shape of life and the shape of fiction, meaning human life history, the basic relationships, motives, the phases of life, and how they correlate with the structure of narrative and dramatic fiction. And then talk about the attitudes towards death that are taken in literature. And then the emotions activated in depictions of death, emotions both in the authors and in the audience. And then finally, why imagine death? What kind of purpose or adaptive function could it have? So the shape of life and the shape of fiction. A story that is whole has a beginning, middle, and an end. Aristotle, one of the most famous declarations in literary theory. When I first heard that 50 years ago, I scoffed and thought that, well, that's a kind of an empty statement. I've gradually come to have respect for that idea, but only after I gave some content and answered this question, but a beginning, middle, and end of what? And the answer that I came up with is that imaginatively meaningful events are shaped by human life history, the basic motives, phases of life, and social relations that constitute human nature. And we now have a pretty good sense of what those are. Survival instincts, David gave a good account of all the ways in which survival instincts emerge at different points in life and in different kinds of relationships. Maternal bonding and extended infant dependence, one of the most basic conserved features of all mammalian life. Specifically human, extended childhood, group living, pair-bonded dual parenting, monogamy. Bernard Chapet's arguments on the predominance of monogamy, its normative character in human mating relationships. Those arguments are persuasive to me. Differing male and female mating preferences, male and female cooperative networks, bilateral kinship networks, something peculiarly human, networks extending from both the mother and the father. Tension between dominance and egalitarianism. Chris Bohm convinced me that that's a fundamental feature of all human social relationships. Identification with a social group and in-group, out-group moral differences. You probably know that thinking about the evolution of human sociality has been developing pretty rapidly in the past few years. And I think one of the most important ideas that's come out of all of that is that humans aren't individuals, and they don't simply use other individuals as resources, mating opportunities, but they actually identify imaginatively with a social group. They have a tribal imagination. And then finally, imaginative culture. Of all the items on this list, this is the one that's probably least well established. Cultural theory has been developing rapidly over the past few years, but culture is still often thought of primarily as technology or social relationships. I'm going to argue that religion, ideology, the arts, every form of imagination is peculiarly human and is part of the human adaptive repertory. So fictional stories contain organized sequences of action defined by emotionally charged motives, and those motives arise, develop, encounter obstacles, and reach some definite conclusion. That is, a beginning and a middle and an end, and a beginning and a middle and an end of all of those aspects of human life that generate emotions. So they culminate in either frustration or fulfillment. That's the basic emotional spectrum that determines when something ends, how it ends. So survival, as David was saying, is a basic motive. Many forms of motive. Many stories are pure adventure survival stories. Jack London's kind of a specialist in survival literature. Probably many of you have read To Build a Fire. It's widely anthologized. A man in the Arctic at 60 degrees below zero. He goes out walking alone, steps his foot in a running spring, tries to start a fire, can't, and dies. To love of life, another man in the Arctic breaks his leg 300 miles from the coast, makes his way to the coast, starving, naked, all of his skin rubbed off by crawling, but he's alive. So that's death or avoiding death is the natural end of a survival story. It's also the natural end of a story in which the goal is to kill an enemy. Just for example, Hamlet kills his uncle, who had murdered his father, and Hamlet is himself killed. And once you've got a stage full of corpses, story's over. End of story. Death can also be the terminus of any motive, phase of life, or social relationship. And I'm just going to run through and give a few examples. I won't take the time to talk a lot about the particular literary works. Growing up or raising children, a child dies before reaching adulthood. A fairly common form of pathetic story. Thomas Mann's Buddenbrooks ends with the death of a child. Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Match Girl, famous story. Girl lies dead. Romantic sexual pair bonding, the death of a loved one. Many tragedies built on this. Romeo and Juliet, Othello. Probably only the people my age will recognize Love Story, but it was a huge hit in the 60s. Just a very simple story. They love each other and she dies. That's all there is to it. The same for Hemingway, A Farewell to Arms. Basically, that's it. He's an ambulance driver in the First World War, and they leave the war. They're in love. She gets pregnant. She dies. That's the end of the story. Parental care. Parents die before the child grows up. This is one of the most common forms of children's literature, both for adults. David Copperfield, he's an orphan. James and the Giant Peach. Roald Dahl is a specialist in orphan children. Probably the most successful, popular children's literature, cultural phenomenon in our time. The Harry Potter stories, he's an orphan. His parents have died. For obvious reasons, that's one of the most important things that can happen to a child. Other family relationships, the death of relatives. Cain and Abel, the very second story in the Bible, important enough so that it comes in right there. Brothers and sisters in King Lear, there are two brothers, two sisters, only one's living at the end. Yu Hua is the most famous and popular contemporary Chinese novelist, has a novel called Brothers, and one has sex with the other's wife, and the dead brother, or the betrayed brother, commits suicide, and his brother then goes into permanent grief, but he's wealthy and arranges to have the brother's ashes sent into outer space so it'll be permanently circulating. Living in a community is a very dangerous thing. Doesn't feel like it in this kind of an environment, but we've heard of the number of males who, in an ancestral environment, who die from violence. And it is a very common theme in literature. You probably most of you at some point have read The Lottery, Shirley Ann Jackson's story. At the end of this, she wins the lottery, and so the whole village gets together and stones her to death. 1984, Lord of the Flies. You could multiply all of these examples by thousands or tens of thousands of times. Striving for dominance, killing or being killed. Macbeth, War and Peace. And then bringing in imaginative culture, intellectual, spiritual, or artistic quest, the death of the seeker. Hamlet, as one of the great intellectuals in world literature, dies. Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain, the main character spends several years on an intellectual quest, and the First World War comes along, and the last scene is of him heading across an open field with very little chance of survival when he gets to the other side. The Moon and the Sixpence, a story about Gauguin dying of syphilis in Tahiti. Everything in life is threatened by death. All individual lives and all life stories end in death. Birth and death make each individual life a discrete entity, something with a beginning, middle, and an end, with continuity and integrity of structure, then with an ultimate cessation. So this is coming back and giving Aristotle the credit that I failed to give him 50 years ago. Qualifications, I'm sure, will spring to mind immediately in an audience like this. Progeny, the winning ticket in this lottery isn't your own personal survival, but the survival of your genes. A lot of people say making a lasting effect on the world, making a lasting contribution, endowing a university is a way to perpetuate yourself. Many people still believe in an immortal soul. Probably a smaller proportion of people in this audience than in almost any other audience you could gather together. Surveys have indicated that biologists are the most atheistical and the least religious of all academic groups. Continuity of nature, a lot of people go for that. I'm going to dissolve, go back into the ground, turn into nutriments for the plants, and come back up daisies. Still, at some level of consciousness, for the individual organism, death is final and absolute. No matter how much, I read obituaries, just kind of a vice. Read them over breakfast. They're little life stories. And about half of them, where I live in St. Louis, which is a very Catholic town, begin with received into the arms of Jesus. And yet you don't see a lot of people hurrying to make that leap into the arms of genius. There's still a reluctance. So the threat of death and the ultimate certainty of death massively affect the way people envision their lives. It prompts them to take some stance, adopt some attitude, pronounce some belief about life as a whole. And that is one of the main things that literature is about. So this is just an impressionistic survey of the kind of attitudes that people have towards death, the way that it appears in literature. The first is avoidance. There's a scene in Jane Eyre, the novel Jane Eyre. Early on, she's a little girl. She's being quizzed by a minister, a priest, who says, "Little girl, do you know what hell is?" And she says, "Yes, it's a burning pit of fire." And he says, "Well, what must you do to avoid going to hell?" And she says, "Well, I must keep well and not die." And that attitude is not only childish, it's an idea that has governed most of our mythical history. The idea that death is unreal, illusory, it's only a transition to eternal life. And as you can see, that goes all the way back in our literary tradition. There's Homer, Odysseus goes to the underworld to get information. He sees all the shades in the underworld. He has to give them some blood, and they drink the blood to come back to life enough to be able to talk to him. That's a very ancient, archaic, and primitive idea about death, just a gradual fading away in the underworld. Virgil in the Aeneid was partly imitating Homer, but he was also setting up the whole Christian arrangement for the afterlife. Aeneas goes to the underworld, he meets his father, who tells him, well, the dead are sorted when they come in, the bad go to hell, the good go to purgatory, and they all ultimately end up in the Elysian fields, the good. And that idea then is replicated through the whole Christian epic with Dante, the Paradiso, Milton, Paradise Regained, the Pearl poet in the 14th century. His daughter dies, he dreams, she comes to him in a dream and tells him, life is great over here on the other side of death. Bunyan, Pilgrim's Progress, actually is not that important for Americans, but for the British, this was, at least through the First World War, the most powerful imaginative influence that people experienced. Somebody did a study of literary allusions in the letters of British soldiers in the First World War, and next to the Bible, Bunyan was the single most frequently cited text. It's an allegory. Christian sets out on the journey through the world, goes through Vanity Fair, goes through the slough of despond, has trials and tribulations, and then he gets to the river of death, and he has to cross it, and on the other side is the celestial city, which is all pearls and gold. Lilith, the 19th century fantasy, has one of the most impressive visions of death I've ever read. MacDonald, who was the precursor for the modern fantasy literature like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, envisions all the dead, everybody who's ever lived, in a giant morgue, extending far beyond what the eye can see. You know, billions and billions of corpses, all each laid out on a slab, all in a kind of a quiet, low light atmosphere, waiting for the resurrection. I left Joyce in there. You mostly think of Joyce as scatology and sex, but that's a memoir. And when he was at a Jesuit school and he listened to a hellfire and damnation sermon that vividly impressed on him the reality of hell and made him religious for a little while. Emotional withdrawal, repudiating life, at least one's own life, declaring it nugatory, of no worth or significance, the kind of thing that you see in Stoic or Epicurean philosophy, a way to kind of stand back and say death doesn't matter. Here's a famous example, Shakespeare's Macbeth responding to the news that his wife has committed suicide. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day, to the last syllable of recorded time, and all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle, life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Acceptance. Now, this is more complicated, I think. Listening to the question and answer session last night after the talk, I was interested to hear various people come up with versions of the standard forms of getting to an acceptance of death. Affirming the reality of it, and one's own death in particular, while retaining a calm and peaceful state of mind. There are a bunch of different ways you can get to this. Death is the end of suffering. Death is the cure for all disease. Death is the end of all sorrow. Death is inevitable. There's no point in resisting. We did hear that last night. Hamlet has a famous soliloquy, if it be not now, yet it will come. If it is not now, yet it will be. Death is less important than something else. I fear death. I love honor more than I fear death. Dulciet decrum est pro patria more. It's sweet and fitting to die for your country. Death is natural. It's part of life. We hear that a lot. Heard that last night. And death makes one love life all the more. We heard that last night. I don't have enough time to give you examples of all of these, but I'll settle and give you an example or two of the last two. Death is natural and it's part of life. This is, I think, one of the most paradigmatic statements in Shakespeare. For me, it seems to summarize his whole attitude towards life. Men must endure their going hence even as their coming hither. Ripeness is all. Going hence meaning dying, coming hither meaning being born. Death is not the opposite of life. It exists as part of them. Haruki Murakami's contemporary Japanese novelist. And this is Wallace Stevens in a poem, Sunday Morning. He's sitting with his wife on the patio. He's trying to convince her that she doesn't need to go to church, she doesn't need Christianity, that a naturalistic vision of life is enough. Deer walk upon our mountains, and the quail whistle about us their spontaneous cries. Sweet berries ripen in the wilderness, and in the isolation of the sky at evening, casual flocks of pigeons make ambiguous undulations as they sink downward to darkness on extended wings. This is a novel from about 20 years ago, Jim Crace, Being Dead. It's quite an interesting novel. It begins with a middle-aged couple. They're both zoologists. They've gone to a beach where they first made love 30 years before, just a little anniversary celebration. They're sitting naked or half naked on the beach, and a man comes along, just a violent, retarded man who kills them to take their belongings, beats them to death with a piece of granite. And the novel moves back and forth between recounting episodes of their lives leading up to that moment of death and passages describing in precise ecological detail their decomposition. And it's a way of meditating on the significance of their lives and their deaths. Their bodies stay there for a week. And Crace says that their bodies could have provided material for the slides that one of the characters, Celise, shows to her zoology students at the beginning of each of her classes. She tells them, "You'll have to make yourselves companionable with death if any of you want to flourish as zoologists." She meant that fear of death is fear of life, a cliche among scientists and preachers too. Both know that life and death are inextricably entwined, the double helix of existence. Both want to give life meaning, only because it clearly has none, other than to replicate and decompose. Hard truths. I was impressed by this. Crace is a pretty good writer, not a great writer, but he's one of the few who manages to bring clearly into focus a modern biological, zoological vision of life, to replicate and decompose. Death makes one love life the more. These zoologists have an adult daughter, Syl, and she has to come to the beach to identify the bodies once they're found a week after they've died. And after identifying the bodies, she goes to a church to meditate. She's not religious, she's just looking for a quiet place. And while she's at the church, she's thinking, she just doesn't believe any of the things the people are singing in their hymns. She walked away from the church, euphoric and dismayed at once, and only praying that her life would have as much love as her parents had. How should the dying spend their time when life's short portion shrinks with every waking day? Her jean suppliers had closed shop. Their daughter was the next in line. She could not duck out of the queue. She would not waste her time in this black universe. There is no remedy for death or birth, except to hug the spaces in between. Live loud, live wide, live tall. Their deaths were her beginning. So now I'm going to talk a little about the emotions that are activated in depictions of death. And again, this is an impressionistic survey. But the first thing to say is that death in fiction isn't always meaningful. It's not always a subject for reflection on life. It's not always an occasion for deep feeling. In murder mysteries, death is merely a puzzle to be solved. I think it's one of the emotional, psychological functions of murder mysteries and action movies is that it trivializes death. It makes it just a mechanical event that doesn't evoke any emotion in the viewer. In domestic fiction, death is often just a social and economic fact. Victorian novels, for example, almost always involve marriages and funerals. And the funerals involve wills and inheritances. And it's a matter of how you're going to redistribute all those resources. It reorganizes all the pieces on the playing board. But when death is emotionally meaningful, there are three kinds of emotions that seem to be activated: cruelty, horror, and grief. Cruelty, sensations of pleasure at the death of somebody else. Grief, sensations of sorrow, sadness at the death of somebody else. Horror, mainly that fear of your own death, but projected empathetic with the death of other people. Cruelty can involve rage, vindictive spite, moralistic retribution, victorious exultation, and sadism. And I'll just throw up a few examples. Again, this is part of the central tradition of all literature, not just Western. There's Homer, the Aeneid. Those are long, detailed, gruesome depictions of metal crunching bone and slicing into flesh. Same thing in the Three Kingdoms, about the Han Empire in China. All the history plays, the Shakespeare history plays about the War of the Roses, those are full of decapitations and slaughter. And then there's the whole private tradition with like the Marquis de Sade, 120 Days of Sodom, Stephen King's Carrie, American Psycho, Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, The Wasp Factory. Horror, the heart of horror as a genre is fear, but fear is often intermingled with disgust or revulsion. You can use Ekman's basic emotions as a way of helping to organize these and give some kind of logical structure to the impressionistic survey. These are Renaissance and Jacobean dramas, the Titus Andronicus. I counted them up once. There are more dead people in Titus Andronicus than in any other work of the same length. And the most gruesome possible kinds of deaths, including killing children, baking them in a pie, and feeding them to the parents, and then telling the parents afterwards what they just ate. Poe, the whole horror tradition, Dracula, The Haunting of Hill House, ghost stories. And then there's naturalistic horror. Jude the Obscure, Thomas Hardy's novel, has a depressive child who hangs his other 3 children and himself on the grounds that we are too many. There are too many of us. We can't feed us. Lord of the Flies, classic high school book, vision of death and decay. Catch-22 is probably the most prominent book in American culture after the Second World War, seemed to capture the mind of a whole generation. And it circles around one main scene, keeps coming back to it and playing a little more of it each time. The death of Snowden, the bombardier in the airplane. Yossarian keeps trying to patch up his wounded leg and gets it done and feels relief, and then opens his flak jacket and all of his intestines fall out. And that's the vision of human mortality. And Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been? Joyce Carol Oates is a docudrama, fictional recounting of an actual serial killer in California. So grief shapes 2 main genres in literature, elegy and tragedy. These are high literature. Cruelty and horror are considered more sensationalistic. There are great books in those traditions, but the high canonical literature reaches its status through evoking grief. Elegy is a farewell to the dead, memorializing them. I started just making a list while I was doing this of all the poems that have been written memorializing the dead, and you could come up with vast anthologies of those. But I'm just going to give you one example from Virginia Woolf, To the Lighthouse. It's the central character into The Lighthouse. It's a single day in the life of the Ramsey family. They're at a beach house, and the central figure in the story is Virginia Woolf's mother. And this is a comment from her journals, her memoir. It is perfectly true that my mother obsessed me, in spite of the fact that she died when I was 13, until I was 44. Then one day, walking around Tavistock Square, I made up, as I sometimes make up my books, To the Lighthouse, in a great and apparently involuntary rush. I wrote the book very quickly, and when it was written, I ceased to be obsessed by my mother. I no longer hear her voice. I do not see her. I suppose that I did for myself what psychoanalysts do for their patients. I expressed some very long-felt and deeply felt emotion, and in expressing it, I explained it and laid it to rest. So she stopped obsessing about her mother, but if she was like most people, she continued probably to dream about her parents until she herself took her own life. Tragedy, violent passions that conclude in exhausted sorrow for the survivors. You could spend a professional career niggling around with the definitions of tragedy, but this covers the main emotional characteristic of it. You have an empty stage and people are sad and exhausted at the end. It begins with in our tradition with the Greeks. Is part of the Renaissance with King Lear, Medea, Phaedra. There's a major 19th century tradition, Anna Karenina, Tess the D'Urbervilles, and then into the 20th century, an American tragedy of mice and men, Things Fall Apart, an African story. So, why imagine death? Why fill the mind with images of cruelty, horror, and grief? Why not go have a picnic and think about pleasant things? I think there's a reason for it. The imagination is part of the universal repertory of behaviorally modern human adaptive capacities. I've been interested to see the most recent research on the evolution of imagination, the brain's default mode network, neuroimaging about life narratives, self-narratives, and the way that activates the same parts of the brain that are activated in writing and reading fiction. Humans use their imaginations to connect the present with the past, with anticipations of the future, to entertain cosmological ideas, to evaluate behavior through reference to abstract moral codes, and to construct autobiographical narratives. They also interpret events by comparing them with stories, myths, and images drawn from their culture. Building a virtual imaginative world through stories, poems, and plays helps behaviorally modern humans direct their own behavior in accordance with imaginative templates imbued with the norms of their cultures. Behaviorally modern humans cannot choose not to imagine their own lives. All life is enveloped in death, and to imagine your life, you also have to imagine your death. That's it.
We have time for questions?
I have sort of a two-part question. In general, is literature typically in response to current cultural trends, or does it tend to be more causal of trends? So more in the forefront versus reaction to trends?
Yes and no, both. There's a reciprocal, there's a loop, a feedback loop. Writers know what their audiences expect, what their audiences want. They do sometimes even do audience testing. Dickens wrote Great Expectations and sent it to a friend, and the friend said, nobody's going to, no, they don't want to hear this unhappy ending, so he wrote a different ending. And but it's also true that authors can fundamentally alter the direction of their culture. I have a friend, John Gottschall, who has a book called The Storytelling Animal, and he brings in a bunch of examples of works that have influenced the course of history. They came out of history, but they also had a major impact on it. Uncle Tom's Cabin, when Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, he said, oh, so you're the little lady who started this great war, the Civil War, because it was a story about the persecution of slaves. He has another example, less edifying example. Hitler went to a production of a Wagner opera with a Wagnerian hero, and came out of it with this rapt, starry look in his eyes, and turned to his companion and said, I'm going to be that character. I'm going to lead my people in a heroic quest. So yeah, both ways. I mean, it's part of the loop.
And then do you find more recently, given how more advanced maybe we're becoming technologically and medically, that when it comes to things like avoidance of death, do we see more fiction around creating immortality versus like an afterlife? So creating ways to continue to live longer in themes of death?
Well, certainly that, yeah, I mean, people are always striving to live as long as they can, but imaginatively, I mean, you see a few instances of I read a science fiction story recently about a woman who chose to, in her late 70s, chose to undergo a surgery that would extend her life a little. And then she lived a little longer, and there was another technological advance, and it just kept going until finally she had been digitalized and become immortal and capable of all joys, all pleasures. I thought of that last night when somebody was talking about whether if we could live forever, we would still value one kind of experience more than another. Basically, she ends up living forever. So there is that fantasy. Yu Hua, the Chinese novelist, has his most recent novel is called The Seventh Day. It opens with a character walking along the street with his eyeball hanging down on his cheek, and he's trying to figure out what happened. He gradually remembers, he was in the restaurant, and there was an explosion. And then he realized, oh yeah, I'm dead. So he's dead through the whole course of the story, and he's wandering in the afterlife, in the land of the dead, which turns out to look very much like the land of the dead in previous literature. You have to be, for example, you have to be buried before your soul can rest. And it turns out that he's not buried, so he goes on a quest to find somebody to bury him. And, I think the basic structures of imagining life after death, they've actually developed historically over. We can tell differences from ancient Egypt and ancient Greece to the Christian medieval period to the present day, but there's still a fairly limited range in which people can think death. There's perhaps a less limited range in which they'll ultimately be able to think immortality. We'll see. I won't see, but.
I was interested in your remark at the end about the importance of having shared stories which we can all relate to because it's kind of part of our common culture. Could you comment more on that and about how some of the stories, which, I mean, of course, every time you gave a new example, you expected most of us to know it, but how important has been the sharing of particular stories in literature across cultures? For example, I'll take the example Dickens's Little Nell,
Right.
One of the most famous tragic
Right.
deaths in literature, which became a cause for immense grief right across North America. When the ship carrying that episode of the novel arrived in New York, people were lined up on the quays, and the captain, they shouted out, "Is she dead?" And the captain shouted down, "She is dead." And everybody fell about weeping. Now, that's a very extraordinary phenomenon. Of course, it couldn't have happened in earlier history because we didn't have access to those sort of communication which could be spread across millions of people. But I'd like to comment on that and also how it relates to things which actually aren't fiction but might as well be fiction, like the death of Princess Diana.
Right. No, I think that's true. That one of the main arguments for the adaptive function of the arts is all of the arts, not just literature, is that it forms a medium for collective experience. Last year at HBEST, the keynote lecture was given by Tomasello talking about shared attention and the crucial, peculiarly human function that's had for our development. People need to feel part of a community. They have an overwhelming desire to share experience with other people. And it can be fictional. It's often a blurred boundary. Fictional stories built out of real stories. It gives an immediate emotional satisfaction, and it also has consequential effects on sharing norms. I did a study with several other people, did a survey of protagonists and antagonists in Victorian novels, and we put a questionnaire on the website, listed 2,000 characters, and got thousands of literary scholars all over the world to go fill out questionnaires, pick a character like Little Nell, and fill out a questionnaire on her and say whether she's a protagonist or an antagonist, what kind of personality she's got, how you feel about her emotionally. And one of the things we discovered was that it forms a virtual imaginative community in which people affirm their shared norms and feel themselves to be a community. It's one of the ways in which they're able to bring themselves into collective action. In organizing communities for mass efforts, propaganda is always indispensable. And propaganda is simply a rough and ready, crude form of shared imaginative experience.
Do you think there's a possible danger that that function will be undermined if literature proliferates too widely so that people don't share it? I mean, there's an example. When I was growing up, we all read the same stories.
Right.
I could have assumed that anybody I knew would have read the stories I've done. Now, that's less true. It's still partly true. They've mostly read Harry Potter, but on the other hand, there's so much more to choose from that, in fact, we're beginning to lose that, the easy assumption that everybody will have known the same stories we do.
No, I think that's true. I think there's a threat. There are too many books. Yeah, 50 years ago, when I was just beginning as a scholar, I read a statement that profoundly affected me. It said, most books should be articles, most articles should be footnotes, most footnotes should not be written. But I'm not going to be able to do anything about that. It is an issue. I mean, through the first part of the 20th century, up to the First World War, the whole culture shared through the West certain kinds of mythic traditions. They had biblical literature, they had rituals, saints' days. They lived in the church. They were buried in the church. They were baptized, married in the church. There was a glue, a bond. And it's quite true that at the present time we see a greater ideological and political polarity than we've experienced, at least in America and in Europe both, since the Second World War. Non-shared narratives, those do present a problem for social cohesion. They do. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Joe Carroll.